I'm continuing my look at some of my favourite King's Gambit games with a sparkling win by Bobby Fischer, played in Yugoslavia in 1968. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via Patreon or PayPal. Right, so this game, Fischer against Minic, played in Vinkovci in Yugoslavia in 1968. So a little bit more up to date than the Immortal game played in 1851. But nevertheless, the King's Gambit's quite a rare visitor in the top tournament chess scene in the 1960s. And, well, something of a surprise that Fischer is playing it actually. But in fact, in round one of this tournament, he'd already played the King's Gambit against Bob Wade, English New Zealand player. And Wade played knight f6, but maybe we'll look at that game another time. But here Minic played e takes f4, and instead of knight f3, Fischer played bishop c4. Now, maybe this came as a bit of a surprise to Minic, because he was clearly very confused by this and came up with something a little bit substandard. He didn't risk playing queen h4 check, as we saw played in the so-called Immortal game. And Fischer had faced that before, actually. He won a game in the US Championship in 1963 against Larry Evans, strong player. And Fischer completely outplayed him strategically, I should say. But Minic didn't risk queen h4, and in some ways I think that's a good strategy, although I don't think knight e7 is the best move there. Fischer prevented d5 with knight c3, and Minic insisted he wanted to get in d5. So it looks like that bishop has been shut out of play. Okay, so how do you deal with this with white? What would you play here? Well, instead of taking, which would allow black's knight here, Fischer just dropped back with bishop b3. And actually that leaves black already with something of a dilemma. How do you develop with the knight stuck on e7? Well, if the knight moves straight away, then this pawn can be taken. And if that pawn advances, then the knight simply drops back to e2, and now the diagonal is open. Or bishop e6, then, well, that's pretty comfortable for white. After knight here, protecting that pawn, queen e2 is a great move, with threats on the e-file and potential later on to exchange here and give a check on b5. That, as we'll see, queen e2 is a very clever move, often in the King's Gambit. So Minic took on e4 and knight d5, so that shuts out this bishop for the moment. And here is an excellent move from Fischer. Of course, white could play c4, d4, you could castle, but queen e2 is a very clever move. So obviously there are threats on the e-file. Well, indeed, knight f6 is checkmate in one move. That's the big threat. So black blocks it. Now the knight is driven away. And d4. White simply wants to take back the pawn on f4 with a tremendous position. And of course, g5 isn't possible here because of that pin on the e-file. And if knight e6, then protecting that pawn, then d5 just blasts the way through, and you can see that could be very, very unpleasant for black with d6 coming. So you can see how strong the queen is on e2. So Minic simply castled, and bishop takes f4. And now we see another point behind queen e2. White is ready to castle queenside. So for example, if bishop g4 castles queenside, and well, white's pieces look absolutely tremendous. So instead, black played knight e6, hitting the bishop, hitting this pawn. So that did push the bishop back Now, castle's queenside is still a very strong option for white, so Minic checked. And here is another typical King's Gambit move. And it shows Fischer playing in a very undogmatic way. Of course, the knight could drop back, but then white would lose a little bit of the initiative. You know, that knight is good on e4. Fischer just played king f2. An excellent move. Now, if you're a follower of the channel, you might have seen my video covering the game between Spassky and Sirewan, the Candidates Tournament 1985, where Spassky unexpectedly played king f2 in the opening, and that was a devastating move, bringing the king's rook into play. Do check out that video, it's fantastic. Now, this isn't quite as devastating. Nevertheless, this leaves black in a very awkward situation because that bishop is a bit stranded on b4. Really doesn't look great. And white is going to castle sort of manually, putting the rook on f1, and the king can come back to g1 anyway. Knight d7, so black is in a hurry to develop. c5, excellent move. So that shuts out the bishop and also opens this diagonal, as we're going to see f7. So often a weak square in the King's Gambit. Knight f6, black, knight f6, black is hurrying to develop, and that helps a little bit. And now simply rook f1. And white is ready just to drop the king back and start attacking on the f-file. Black has a problem here. That bishop really doesn't look great. The knight blocks in the bishop on c8. So that's why knight f4 was played. Fischer simply exchanges, pushes the queen back, and drops back with the king. So the king has found security. The f-file is cleared, and white is ready to play knight to e5, hitting the f7 pawn, and already looks really nasty. If bishop g4, pinning that knight, then the queen comes down to e7 with, well, potential pressure on the f7 pawn, but also looking at the pawn on b7. Now that's a crucial pawn to win because, well, it'll hit the bishop, but also that pawn looks pretty weak. You can imagine a knight coming in here and c6 simply dropping with a completely winning position. So black tried bishop h3, hitting the rook. And if the rook moves, then rook e8, and black is back in the game. That's really not quite so clear anymore. But Fischer, well, it's all straight on from here. He seized his chance, knight e5. He's not bothering about moving that rook. So it's all about the f7 square. So Minic gratefully took the rook. So Fischer in exchange down, but f7 is falling. And it's really difficult to defend this position. Bishop d2. So this is perhaps the last chance to try and check and exchange queens and try to attack this pawn. But Fischer didn't rush it. Of course, you can take on f7, but no, very calm. Rook f3, just preventing an exchange on e3. And now it's pretty bad. I mean, the king could go in the corner, but you can just take on f7. Rook d8. Knight takes pawn on f7. Rook takes. And now, after Fischer's next move, black resigned. Perhaps Minic was just expecting this to be taken and the king goes in the corner, but no. Queen e7. And that is a straight knockout. Queen e7 finishes the game. Minic resigned. Queen takes rook, threatened. Queen takes rook, also threatened. And if rook here, you take, and now it's mate. Rook takes, queen takes, And now queen f8 mate. I mean, there really is no defense after queen e7. That is game over. 24 moves. Wow. Absolutely devastating. And it just shows you what can happen when you play, a sideline, when you take your opponent by surprise. And, well, Minic was just left floundering in this game. If you want a survey of this move, bishop c4, then actually I covered it on my Patreon channel. So do subscribe if you want to check out the opening surveys there. Then I took a look at the pros and cons of bishop c4, actually in a video I did last year. So do check out Patreon. You'll find the link down there. And, well, if you look at the video on the opening page of the PowerPlayChess channel, you'll see more details there. Thanks for watching.